Hi guys, it's Alex here with Chessfactor.com, and today we're going to be covering a game of the Sicilian Dragon, the Yugoslav Attack, which is not just the main line for white against the Sicilian Dragon, but it's also, in my opinion, the toughest challenge for Sicilian Dragon players to face. So let's take a look at what we're talking about. The game begins with e4, c5, knight f3, pawn to d6, pawn to d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight to f6, attacking the pawn, knight c3, and now the dragon starts with the move pawn to g6. Black intends to fianchetto his bishop and go for a quick kingside castling. How to set up the Yugoslav attack for white? Well, white plays the move bishop to e3. He anticipates that black's bishop on g7 is going to exert pressure against his knight on d4 and also indirectly against his knight on c3. So it makes a lot of sense for white to place his bishop there and protect d4. Black plays bishop to g7 and white now plays f3. So an interesting point worth noting is that black could not play the move knight to g4 immediately. Knight g4 harassing this bishop might seem a little bit annoying, but after bishop to b5 check, if black now blocks against the check on d7, then let's say with bishop d7, then white can actually collect this knight on g4 because black cannot capture the queen since his own bishop is pinned. Of course, black also doesn't really want to put a knight on c6 because there's two pieces attacking versus only one. However, after the move bishop to g7, the ideas of knight g4 start to come a little bit more into play because bishop b5 check can now be met with king to f8. So therefore, after bishop g7, it makes a lot of sense for white to spend the move playing f3, fortifying e4 and covering the g4 square. Black now castles, and white continues with his plan of queen to d2 to castle queenside. Now, the danger for the dragon player is that white is going to storm black with a very strong attack, and the fact that black has his pawn on g6 makes for an easier target. It's a more accessible target than, let's say, white's queenside, where no pawns have moved. Why is this the case? Well, the reason is because let's say that white wants to make contact with the black pawns. White can just play one, and on the second move already strike a g6. If, on the other hand, black wants to make contact, he will require 1, 2, and a third move, at the very, very least. It's also easier for white to deal with these moves because the fact that he hasn't moved his pawns at all gives him a little bit greater flexibility in responding. He could, for example, play b3 and keep this pawn like this and use it almost as a shield for his own king. On the other hand, if this pawn reaches h5, black doesn't have similar flexibility. He cannot play g5 because the pawn would be hit. So therefore, it's a dangerous attack that awaits black, but the black dragon players consider that they have enough resources. After queen d2, black typically continues with knight c6, and here white has two very popular options. The one that we're going to be looking at is the move bishop to c4, and the idea can be really seen, the logic behind this move can really be seen and appreciated when we realize that the other major move that white has is queenside castle. If white castles queenside, black can now actually play the move pawn to d5 and strike in the center. When you anticipate a kingside attack, a flank attack, it's very often a good idea to strike in the center if you can, and white's relative lack of control over d5 enables black to do this. Now, of course, theoreticians and strong players have analyzed this position, and they consider that white has a couple of very good options here. One of them is queen to e1, where suddenly the possibility, or rather the fact that black has played d5 might make him a little bit worried because now this x-ray against the queen feels a little bit more problematic. For example, black could not take the pawn because after knight takes c6, he would not be in time to recapture the knight since his queen would be lost. In addition, there is a major line where white captures here on d5, knight takes d5, knight takes c6, b takes c6, And it's not considered a very good idea for white to capture this piece twice. If you can see, knight takes d5, pawn takes d5, and queen takes d5 here would net white a pawn. But the problem with playing like this is that white has spent a lot of time winning a pawn, but in the end, black has tremendous attacking possibilities against the white king. So really do not recommend to capture this pawn. And so what they do, instead of capturing the pawn, what white tends to do is he plays the move bishop to d4 to lock down a little bit of the attacking possibilities that black has, inviting the move e5, and now he goes bishop c5, attacking the rook. I'll end the line with just the next move here, or perhaps the next move for each side. It's really, I think, very nice to see how aggressive Sicilian Dragon players can be, that the main move here for black is actually bishop to e6. It's not defending this rook, and black decides, if you want to capture this rook, feel free, but after a move like queen takes f8, I'm suddenly going to have threats like bishop h6, where your queen and king being on dark squares is going to be quite regrettable for white. And even if you are able to sidestep a threat like that, have these very strong bishops pointing directly at your king. You have a delay in development here on the king side, and I also have a semi-open file pointing in the direction of your king. So there's really too much danger here for white, and in fact, white pretty much always declines this rook and instead plays a move with the king on c1, plays a move like knight to e4 here. And tries to argue, keep the position relatively closed, and tries to argue that especially this pawn here, this isolated pawn, and this weak square on c5 gives white an advantage. But I like more the way to play sort of with bishop to c4, which we're about to take a look at here, which stops all of these d5 ideas. So let's go back to the position with bishop, where white plays bishop c4. So here in this position, white goes bishop c4 and stops all the d5 ideas. Now black continues his development with bishop to d7, and now, and only now, does white castle queenside. After queenside castle, black plays rook c8 and x-rays this bishop. So there's a little bit of a concern here now for white that black can at any moment capture on d4, or perhaps even capture first on e4, some kind of tactical ideas. For example, if it were black to play, maybe knight takes e4, pawn takes knight, and now knight takes d4, and you can see that if white captures the knight back, black will actually win this bishop. So the whole operation has netted black a pawn. So because of all of this, white usually drops the bishop back to b3. And this is really one of the absolute mainline positions, if not the mainline position of the dragon. And black has a variety of ways to play, but typically black goes knight to e5 in order to get access to the c4 square, and also to open up the scope of the rook on c8. One of the things that characterizes Sicilian defense play is that opening up of the c-file. It's a semi-open c-file for black. He has no pawn on that file, so he can put his active heavy pieces, while white has no pawn on the d-file, so he can tend to exert more pressure on the d-file himself. So after rook c8 and bishop b3, knight e5, now white plays the move king to b1. He cannot really prevent knight c4, so he allows it. It's not really a huge deal for white if knight c4 happens. For example, knight c4, bishop takes c4, rook takes c4. Now white would start his attack, g4, b5. Black tries to respond in kind, but white, for example, has a nice point, which is b3. And if the black rook starts to step back, then white can actually shift the direction of play and grab this pawn on b5. And overall, his position is going to be quite good, because his attack may have slowed down a little bit, and he may have even weakened himself a little bit. But a pawn is a pawn, and he will now have 3 pawns to weather the storm against just 1. The dark squares will be a little bit weak, but concrete analysis shows that white is doing quite well. In fact, because of this, I really like, and I wanted to show you one example here of black sacrificing an exchange. It's very common in the dragon that black does indeed give up an exchange. We already saw black offering the exchange on f8, but now we're going to see black offering the exchange on c3, which is extremely typical in the dragon. Most of the time, it's done when you have a situation, let's imagine the queen is here, when you have a situation where white's pawns get doubled. But in this case, black can actually create a doubling of the pawns in a little bit of an original way, not with the direct capture, but instead with the move b4, ignoring the rook. Now if white captures the rook, of course if white doesn't, then black is no longer losing a pawn. If white captures the rook, now black takes, and we see once again there is this doubling up of the pawns, and after queen c7, well, white is certainly doing quite well. He's up a pawn and he's also got an exchange to boot. So the material advantage for white is huge. But on the other hand, his king is much less safe than black's. Black has the bishop pair. And overall, with this problematic structure, black will be the only one attacking. So this is one way to play for black. But overall, white's chances are certainly better in these lines. So let's go back. Okay, so in this position, white has just played the move king b1, and we took a look at knight to c4. Now we're going to take a look at the main line, rook e8, and this is what was played in the game. Black decides to play a useful move here because knight c4 does not, convince him. It's not to everybody's taste as black to either lose the pawn on b5 or to lose an exchange and a pawn, right? So the main line is rook to e8, and now this gives white time to attack. So white plays h4 and simply threatens the possibility of either h5, immediately sacrificing a pawn. Let's say that black captures the pawn, white will go g4 and will be happy to have sacrificed the pawn, because when the knight moves, white will at some point seek to exchange these bishops, the dark squared bishops, the key defender of the position for black. This is something really to keep in mind as a white player playing against the dragon, that you really want to play against this piece very often. And here also we can see one of the nice things about having the queen on d2 is that it can transfer along the second rank to the h-file, and attacks can get very, very nasty very quickly if black does nothing and simply allows white to give up a small amount of material like one pawn. So after h4, black usually decides that's something that should be avoided and plays h5 himself. But here, white can continue a bit more slowly with moves like bishop to h6, but I really like the move played in the game, g4. And now after g4, black typically takes the pawn. Otherwise, white will slowly try and crack through, or sometimes will lock down the position on the king side in order to fight against this knight. This is a bit rarer, but will sometimes do this so that the knight has to step back to a bad square, and white can continue his attack with moves like f4 followed by f5, as well as also his control over the d5 square, which is an important square across Sicilians. His control over the d5 square has now improved because the knight is no longer on f6. So therefore, against g4, most black players play h takes g4, and now white sacrifices another pawn with the move pawn to h5. Black really feels kind of stuck here and has to accept the pawn, because otherwise capturing on g6 eventually will create very serious problems and an opening up of the position. So black captures the second pawn. So far, white has given up 2 pawns, and it reminds one of what Bobby Fischer had to say about playing against the Sicilian Dragon. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said something along the lines of, against the dragon, in order to beat the dragon, all you have to do is sack, and checkmate, right? So, of course, it's easier for Bobby Fischer than for most chess players, but what's important to take away is that really for the white side against the dragon, you want to attack and you want to be willing to sacrifice a couple of pawns if needs be, if it's necessary, in order to crash through against the black king. White has to be confident of giving up that material so that his attack comes through faster than black's play on the queen side. So here in this position, white played bishop to h6. Again, we see this idea to play against the dark squared bishop. And now black plays e6 in order to activate the queen and also to take control over the d5 square. White plays rook dg1, not concerned at all about this pawn. For example, if this pawn was captured, now white could even take on h5, because if you play g takes h5, this bishop here is now falling, and this is a lot of material, and especially the black king will be too unsafe. So, therefore, in this position, black plays queen f6. We mentioned already that black wanted to activate that diagonal for his queen. White plays f takes g4, attacking the knight, and now the logic behind this move makes sense, to threaten to take the pawn, and also now there is no knight g3 jump. Therefore, black doesn't have many options of moving this knight, so he first took on h6, queen takes h6, and now he was able to play the move queen g7. Now white cannot take this knight because the queen would be falling, so white has to do something about this. Of course, it would be a bad idea for white to capture the queen, since white is the one attacking, white has the much safer king, so he wants to keep the queens on the board, so white drops the queen back. Now, having played queen g7, black now finally has the option to save his knight with knight f6. If we take a look at the material, white is still down a pawn, but what has he achieved in return? Well, he's got an open h-file, and he also has this move coming up now, the move pawn to g5, which is a very advanced pawn that clamps down on some of the dark squares like h6 and especially f6 against the black kingside. On the other hand, white still has to play very precisely, because if we see, this is an isolated pawn, this is also an isolated pawn, and so between the fact that white is down a pawn and has a worse pawn structure, he's going to be in serious trouble if his attack is not able to crash through. So therefore here, what white played is knight d to e2, which is really a great point. The idea is the knight will come either to f4 or g3 and try to challenge this knight on h5, remove it, so that white can finally try and crash through on the h-file. Black played b5 in order to generate some play on the queen side himself, and now white played knight f4. So, rather than deal with this attack, black decides that he will play the move pawn to a5 and create a threat of his own with the pawn push a4 that would trap this bishop, so generating some play on the queen side. If white were to capture here, as perhaps the black player was expecting or at least hoping for, then after pawn takes h5, white still isn't in time to take this pawn because of a4, and suddenly there are not so many pieces around the black king, and perhaps black's king can escape via f8 and e7 and just about survive and maybe later on try to win the endgame. However, white played really a very, very strong move. Feel free to pause the video if you'd like and try to guess what white's best move is in this position. Okay, I will show it now. So white recognizes that the bishop on g7 was a key defender of the dark squares, and he's managed to get rid of it. So we can see with all these pawns on light squares, remember, light squared pawns can only defend light squares. And so with all the pawns on light squares and no dark squared bishop, the dark squares are really a problem. So white comes up with the brilliant move rook takes h5. Now, the point is that after pawn takes h5, knight will take on h5. And although white has sacrificed first a couple of pawns and now he's gotten them back and the pawn level is, the pawn count is equal, white is now down in exchange, but his attack is coming through much quicker because the attack is against the queen and also the f6 square is under firm white control. So black has to deal with the threat against this queen. He went to h8 and now white planted the very strong knight on f6. it came in with check, and so black went king to g7. And the thing is, white could cash in on a rook here, knight takes e8, and the material would be equal, let's say after either rook takes e8 or maybe bishop takes e8. But the problem that white would face here is what we mentioned previously. The pawn structure is a little bit weak, and also black has some counterplay on the queen side. So white has to be very careful that he doesn't, pick up an exchange or some material, but somehow finds himself with a worse position and not many attacking prospects any longer. So instead, white keeps this very powerful knight, arguing that it's actually superior to this rook. And instead, what white would like to do is he would like to play the move rook h1 now that the g-file is shut down. Unfortunately, if rook h1, queen takes rook will happen, and so white seeks to support the h1 square with his queen. Now, the first option that comes to mind is queen e1, which would create the threat of rook h1. But the problem is with the rook and the queen like this, black could actually fork the rook and queen, and then white would be in trouble. So white played the move queen to c1 with the same idea of rook to h1 next move. Black played queen h2, so that after rook h1, the queen could go to g2. If, of course, he hadn't done this, then after rook h1, the queen would have to go very, very passive to f8, and it would block the king's access. Black plans to try and run away with the king to f8 and e7. So queen h2, rook h1, queen g2. And here white gave the check anyway, and black started to run with his king. Now white played a difficult move to understand. He actually took this bishop with check, and then black recaptured. But the point of this capture is that the bishop on d7, although the knight was worth a lot, the bishop on d7 was protecting this pawn on b5. And it's not so much about winning a pawn. Remember, white rejected winning an exchange before. So why would he care so much about winning a pawn? The point is, it's not only winning the pawn, but rather, if we recall, black had this constant annoying threat of a4 to try and win the bishop. Once this pawn goes, a4 is no longer a threat. Additionally, the knight on b5, very, very importantly, targets this d6 point, which is very weak. Now, black has to defend it and plays king e7, but the king is a little bit overloaded here. White played queen to d1, targeting the pawn, and if black tries to protect the pawn, let's say with his queen, the problem with such a move is that white could still take the pawn, because after queen takes d6, white would have the move rook takes f7 check, and if you take the rook, then the queen falls. So therefore, black has to be very careful in how he deals with this position. Black found perhaps the best move, which is to just take this pawn, so that if white does take the pawn with the queen, black can start to run the king not just to d8, but better to f6, because after queen takes d6, if the king were to run to d8, then at some point there might be a lot of danger on this point on f7. So therefore, in this position, instead white captures with the knight, attacking both rooks. And now black plays knight e5 to defend this point, because white was also creating the threat of rook takes f7 check. So black rather needs to defend the pawn on f7. And now at this point, white finally takes back his exchange. Rook takes c8. And here we can see that the dust has settled a little bit, and white actually, after first trying to crash through on the king side, this is a very, very high level game, which is a correspondence chess game. So it's a higher game than even, it's a more accurate game than even, let's say, a game between the top 5 players in the world, because these guys are not only very, very strong chess players in their own right, but they're also able to consult computers during their games. So we see what an extremely high level game in the Sicilian Dragon might look like. Up a pawn, white was able to convert relatively easily, but it's really interesting, I think, the way in which white crashed through on the king side, very, very instructive. Black did a lot to repel the attack. He generated some counterplay on the queen side, and he even played sort of in both bands at the same time. He played on the king side, he played on the queen side, he even achieved a little bit of central play. White, on the other hand, he was not afraid to sacrifice material. He sacrificed first one pawn, then another pawn, then an exchange, and in the end, the problems in the black position with king safety meant that black needed to spit back material. And funnily enough, we get a situation that for beginner players or club level players sometimes surprises them, that the side that would have started off sacrificing in the end ends up with more material. But this is quite common actually. When you have a strong attack, very often your opponent, even if you first sacrifice material, your opponent has to give something back in order to try and defend his position and defend his vulnerable king. We'll show the final moves in this game just to satisfy your curiosity. White played queen to d4, black played rook to d8, white went queen c5 check, king f6. Now there is some back rank threat here, rook d1 mate, so white went rook h1 to deal with that. Black went queen g2, attacking the rook, and white played rook c1. Now that he's up material, he's happy to stop attacking and just play it safe. Black went queen to e2, and after queen e2, white now played the move a3. Black went rook d1, the rooks got exchanged, king to a2, and now queen to d2 to defend the pawn on a5. White went bishop a4, black played queen to d8, and white went bishop b5, having sort of improved his bishop placement. Black went knight to g6, white went queen e3 to make sure that everything is solid. Black went queen c7, and now white started to advance his pawns with c4. Black placed his knight on f4, c5, e5, and bishop to c4. And here, because it's a correspondence level game and both sides are able to check the computer, black decided, having checked his own computer, that the position was hopeless. And because computers don't make blunders like humans do, if this was a human level game, you're down a pawn perhaps as black, but you might hope to trick your opponent. There's no such tricks in correspondence chess, and black understood that white sooner or later is going to push the pawns, and these two pawns, connected passed pawns, are going to decide his game the game in his favor. The bishop also is probably a stronger piece than the knight, because although the knight may look good and may be defended, it actually has no targets over on the queen side, while the bishop has a target on the king side, is a defensive piece on the queen side, and also dominates this knight. Notice that the forward jumps to the, let's say, towards the enemy king are all controlled by this bishop on c4. So the position is not worth playing on. I hope you really enjoyed this game. I think it was a very instructive game to showcase the ideas. Of course, human players don't play on this level, but hopefully you guys can think about some of the motifs and take them away with you. And if you do want a weapon against the Sicilian Dragon, over at Chessfactor, we certainly recommend the Yugoslav variation. It's the main line, and it's also, I think, the toughest weapon to face as black. So hope you enjoyed the video. Give it a like if you did, and we'll see you in another video.